Reading now from the website, the Institute of the Study of Globalization and Covert Politics. Both FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover and future President Lyndon Baines Johnson were annual guests of the Texas oil men Clint Murchison Sr. and Sid Richardson at Hotel Del Chorro in California and the nearby racetracks. Senator Joseph McCarthy, President Dwight Eisenhower, and Vice President Nixon were among the other guests. These Texas oil men were often brought into the JFK assassination discussion because the Kennedy brothers were interested in banning the oil depletion allowance, which would have forced the oil sector to pay its fair share of taxes. Robert Kennedy instructed the FBI to issue questionnaires asking the oil companies for specific production and sales data. The oil industry, in particular the more financially vulnerable Dallas-based independents, did not welcome this intrusion. The trade publication Oil and Gas Journal charged that RFK was setting up a battleground on which business and government will collide. FBI Director Hoover expressed his own reservations, especially about the use of his agents to gather information in the matter. Hoover's close relationship with the oil industry was part of the oil intelligence link he shared with the CIA Director Alan Dulles and the CIA. Industry big shots weren't just sources, they were clients and friends, and Hoover's FBI was known for returning favours. One of Hoover's good friends, the ultra-rich Texas oilman Clint Murchison Sr., was among the most aggressive players in the depletion allowance dispute. Murchison had been exposed as far back as the early 1950s in Lucy's Time magazine no less, as epitomising the absurdity of this giveaway to the rich and powerful. Another reported visitor of the Hotel Del Chorro meetings was David Harold Byrd. Some of Byrd's connections are covered earlier in the documentary series in Part 6. H.L. Hunt wrote a letter to prominent Democratic Party politicians urging a concerted effort to defeat John F. Kennedy in the 1965 general election, 4 months prior to Kennedy's assassination. Hunt voiced his concerns about the threat of a Kennedy dynasty, stressing that, quote, the stake is the entire future of the nation. That letter was sent to Harry Byrd. Harry F. Byrd was a cousin of David Harold Byrd, who was another Texas oilman who was part of the Suite 8F group. Harry F. Byrd was described by Alden Atch in The Birds of Virginia, an American Dynasty, as the leader of conservative opinion in the United States. Byrd had a close relationship with Sam Rayburn, Lyndon Johnson, and John Connolly. David Byrd pointed out in his autobiography, I'm an Endangered Species, quote, another goal was to reach a rapport with politicians who ran things. Sam Rayburn, Murray Shepard, John Connolly, and Lyndon Johnson on the national scene were to become men I could go to any time that I wanted action, and so were a succession of Texas governors. Byrd, like Murchison and Richardson, was a major Dallas-based oil multimillionaire and maintained business partnerships with oil companies of the Rockefellers and Mellon families. Now jumping to Ordo Ab Chao, this is David Livingstone's website. Byrd was also a member of a right-wing Texas Crusade for Freedom. Now, Crusade for Freedom was touched on in Part 4 as a US propaganda campaign and organ to conceal the CIA's funding of Radio Free Europe. Ann C. Whitman was recruited to be Eisenhower's secretary while working at the New York office of Crusade for Freedom, and she is a node whose career links to several elements of this overall military-industrial intelligence network. Continuing on, members of the Texas Crusade for Freedom included Earl Cabell, the mayor of Dallas, and the brother of the CIA top brass, Charles Cabell. Other members included Ted Dealey, the owner of the Dallas Morning News, and whose father, the Dealey Plaza where Kennedy was assassinated, was named after, and George de Mohrenschildt, the man linked very much so to the Oswalds. Now back to the isgp-studies.com website. Why is this important, you ask? Well, David H. Byrd was a founder of the Civil Air Patrol, where Oswald operated under bizarre CIA asset David Ferrie. Byrd was also the owner of the Texas School Book Depository building, where Oswald was employed in the weeks before he allegedly shot JFK from the same location. There is also the fact that Byrd also employed Oswald's primary Dallas-based patron, the well-to-do George de Mohrenschildt.
After the Second World War, de Mohrenschildt moved to Venezuela, where he worked for Pantepec Oil, a company owned by the family of William F. Buckley. In 1950, he launched an oil investment firm with Edward Hooker, with offices in New York City, Denver, and Abilene. In 1952, de Mohrenschildt moved to Dallas.
Upon his arrival to the area in 1952, de Mohrenschildt became a member of the elite Dallas Petroleum Club, through which he became friends with Murchison, H.L. Hunt, Sid Richardson, George Brown, and others. Back to Order Ab Chao. Jack Crichton, a former OSS officer, was an oil and natural gas industrialist from Dallas. In 1952, Crichton was part of a petroleum syndicate that included Clint Murchison, the DuPonts, and Everett DeGolyer. In the 1950s, Crichton became involved with several oil men who began negotiating with Batista. Key figures involved were the local CIA man in Dallas, J. Walton Moore, and George de Mohrenschildt, who at the time worked for a company called Cuban Venezuelan Oil Voting Trust Company that had been established by William F. Buckley Sr., who had invested $30 million in operations in Cuba. You can see why these oil tycoons wanted to get rid of Castro. So you can see a significant network developing around the JFK assassination. And then there's the case of Louisiana mafia boss Carlos Marcello, who is also said to have been a visitor of Murchison and Richardson's Hotel del Charro. Hoover reportedly sat at the breakfast table each morning with an agent of Marcello. Marcello can be linked to Sergio Ocasio-Smith, Guy Bannister, Clay Shaw, and David Ferrie in New Orleans, and Jack Ruby in Dallas. John Roselli said Hoover had been arrested on charges of homosexuality in New Orleans in the 1920s. Hoover could hardly have chosen a worse city to be compromised in. New Orleans police and officials were notoriously corrupt puppets of a mafia boss and Lansky ally, Carlos Marcello. In 1971, mobster Irvin Ash Resnick talked with the writer Pete Hamill. He spoke of Lansky as a genius and as a man who nailed J. Edgar Hoover. Hamill was told that Lansky had some pictures of Hoover in some kind of gay situation with Clyde Tulson. Lansky was a guy who controlled the pictures, and he had made a deal with Hoover to lay off. That was the reason why, for a long time, the mob had nothing to fear from the FBI.
The Warren Commission pictured them as lone wolves because, for reasons we'll explain later, the FBI never told the Warren Commission the pertinent facts. But the link between Oswald and Ruby did exist, and his name was Carlos Marcello.
Carlos Marcello is the boss, the capo of the mafia structure which centers in the metropolitan New Orleans area and extends into adjoining states.
He was very powerful in the gambling business, but that is not to say that he wasn't in the narcotics business too. And he was. He imported heroin, he distributed heroin. His tentacles in gambling particularly reached all the way to Dallas and Houston.
Jack Ruby ran a striptease bar in Dallas. But where the Warren Commission would have you believe that's all Ruby did, FBI reports show that Ruby was an important figure in gambling, narcotics, and other rackets.
Ruby was described in one FBI document of the late 50s as being heading up a major narcotics operation that ran in Texas, the East, and even into Mexico.
This is David E. Scheim, an MIT-trained mathematician whose fascination with the Kennedy case led him to spend 15 years sifting through tens of thousands of pages of raw data, much of it obtained through the Freedom of Information Act.
We find he has ties to top mafia people around the country. Joseph Civillo, the mafia boss of Dallas, an FBI document describes that Ruby is a frequent visitor and associate of Civillo.
Just how close was Ruby tied to Civillo's boss, Carlos Marcello? This is Joseph Nellis, Washington lawyer and former counsel to the Kefauver Committee, the first big national investigation into organized crime. Could somebody have operated in the fields of gambling and narcotics in Dallas in the early 1960s without Carlos Marcello saying it was okay?
Possible. Not possible, Jonathan. Not without getting a bullet in your head.
That's what would have happened to somebody?
Absolutely. You had to get permission to operate, permission to kill somebody, permission to break a leg, permission to do anything.
Jack Ruby visited Carlos Marcello's brother and underboss in New Orleans just months before the assassination. But Ruby wasn't under the Marcello's thumb alone. It's critical to understand that Ruby was also tied to the Chicago Mafia, which gave Jimmy Hoffa his power. Ruby was born in Chicago and entered the rackets there as a teenager.
And among the things he did, according to FBI records, he ran errands for the Capone mob, was paid $1 for every sealed envelope that he was able to transport from one place to another.
By 1939, Ruby was helping run a junk handlers union local. Ruby was a suspect in the murder of the local's president, but records of the police investigation have disappeared. Ruby continued at the local under its new mafia-connected boss, Paul Red Dorfman.
Now you're talking about a very significant figure in the Teamsters history. Red Dorfman was a local Chicagoan who handled all of the insurance placed by the Teamsters Pension Fund and by their other fund activities. In other words, he was collecting premiums on millions upon millions of dollars.
Well, the Dorfmans were longtime associates of Mr. Hoffa. They certainly had very close links to organized crime in Chicago and elsewhere. And Mr. Hoffa made arrangements that they receive certain plum-type insurance contracts dealing with the pension fund and what have you, which were very lucrative.
There was a sweetheart arrangement between the Dorfman agency and Jimmy Hoffa that did well for both of them. I'm sure that I'm not exaggerating it one bit when I say that Jimmy Hoffa counted himself one of Red Dorfman's best friends.
But Ruby's ties to Hoffa were not just indirect through the Dorfmans. The shocker is that Ruby knew Hoffa himself. Author Dan Moldea, who was the first to publicly assert that the Mafia killed Kennedy, was stunned some years ago when Hoffa's son told him that Jimmy Hoffa had known Ruby since 1939. The son, James Hoffa Jr., a respected Detroit lawyer, then tried to put the remark off the record, so Moldea confirmed it by tape recording a phone conversation between them.
And so I turned on the tape recorder, and on tape, Hoffa admitted it again, that his dad was a friend of, that his friend was a Jack Ruby.
Oh, you told me that your father knew Jack Ruby, but, you know, I remember you said, so what?
1939.
He was the kind of guy everyone knew.
1939.
Oh, that's when he knew him? Back when he was working with Dorfman?
Well, I don't know what he was working with, but he's in Chicago in 39.
Yeah, he was working for Dorfman.
Ruby's work for the Teamsters and the Chicago Mafia continued and naturally came to the attention of the Kefauver investigation in 1950. Remember, the Warren Commission painted Ruby as just a local punk.
We're not interested in local crime or in statewide crime. It had to have an interstate aspect in order for federal jurisdiction to be appropriate. And Ruby's name cropped up in a number of hijackings, some of which were minor and some of which were rather major. He was a member of a group that had ties in Detroit and in Cleveland, Ohio, and to some extent in Florida. So among the others that we grabbed in that dragnet, his name came up. And we interrogated him, as a matter of fact, very briefly to establish the interstate connection, not dreaming, of course, who he would become or what he would become.
Nellis discussed other businesses Ruby was in, such as distributing items to bars and stores. I asked if that was a mob-controlled racket.
Well, if Ruby had it, it was, because I'm sure, as I sit here, that he never did a thing around Chicago without approval from somebody higher up.
The Chicago mob's biggest racket in the 50s and 60s was Jimmy Hoffa and the Teamsters. It would be hard to overstate the evil they represented. Hoffa controlled the union's multi-billion-dollar worker pension funds. Borrowing money from the funds and not paying it back was a big source of mob income.
The amounts of the loans were in the hundreds of millions of dollars, but the tracing of the so-called kickbacks from those loans to Mr. Hoffa and his co-defendants, I would say, would be termed in the millions.
I asked Joe Nellis about Hoffa's and the Dorfmans' use of violence.
Well, Jonathan, let me say this. Violence and enforcement were part and parcel of the operations of the Teamsters with their connections to organized crime, beginning long before the Kefauver investigation. Murder certainly was a major weapon, especially where there was a close daily tie between the local Teamsters Union and the local gangs.
Senator John F. Kennedy joined the Senate's second big organized crime investigation, the McClellan Committee, in 1957. His brother Robert became chief counsel. They were revolted by the violence and corruption they saw in the nation's largest union, and the Kennedys singled out Hoffa as a target.
While leaving the hearings, after these people had testified regarding this matter, did you say that SOB, I'll break his back? Who? You. Say to who? To anyone. Did you make that statement after these people testified before the committee?
I never talked to either one of them after testifying.
I'm not talking about to them. Did you make that statement here in the hearing room after the testimony was finished?
Not concerning them, as far as I know of.
Well, who did you make it about?
I don't know. I may have been discussing somebody in a figure of speech.
Well, who did you make the statement? Whose back were you going to break?
I don't even remember it.
Well, whose back were you going to break, Mr. Hoffa?
They give his speech. I don't even know who I was talking about. I don't know what you're talking about.
This was hardball against organized crime. Bob Kennedy and John Kennedy hated the Mafia all out of proportion, and the Mafia hated them right back.
Did Hoffa ever become an obsession for Bobby Kennedy?
I think it goes all the way, I think the answer is yes, but I think it goes all the way back to Mr. Kennedy's dealings with the McClellan Committee, when he was on the McClellan Committee, and they investigated the Teamsters and Mr. Hoffa. And I think he felt that this was a man that had violated state and federal law with impunity, and that no single local prosecutor who was big enough to really take on Mr. Hoffa.
I might say that in connection with the investigation of the Teamsters Union, and Mr. Hoffa particularly, a great deal of evidence was developed indicating violent beatings and terrorism in connection with those who had opposed the international president of the Teamsters Union. There was testimony developed eventually in connection with threats against me and against my family.
Jack Ruby, meanwhile, had moved to Dallas, one of Carlos Marcello's towns. He later said he was on assignment from the Chicago Mafia, which had close and friendly relations with Marcello.
He said that he was told to go down there, indicating that the underworld connections in Chicago had led him to go to Dallas, to go into the nightclub business there.
The sheriff of Dallas at the time, Sheriff Guthrie, testifies that Ruby came down to Dallas with about 20 thugs and hoodlums in the city. This was at the time when the mob came down to take over the Dallas rackets.
What relations did the Chicago mob have with Dallas, with Carlos Marcello and New Orleans?
Excellent. Oh, now you're talking about one of the key facets of the Kefauver investigation. One of the chief focus of our investigation was to determine the interconnection with one gang and another. It turns out the Chicago mob, above all, I'm talking about Tony Accardo, Sam Giancana, and before him Al Capone, were the most active in arrangements with other mobs in other cities.
Ruby soon became involved in the Cuban gambling and vice operations of Marcello's friend, Florida Mafia boss Santos Traficante. According to records and corroborated testimony, when a triumphant Fidel Castro jailed Traficante and others in 1959, Ruby offered $25,000 to an arms supplier of Castro's for help springing the prisoners. Ruby dashed to Cuba twice, his fare paid by a gambling operative of Traficante's. 4 days after the Kennedy assassination, the CIA learned from a reliable witness that Ruby had personally visited Traficante, a ranking mafia godfather, in his Cuban jail. Clearly, Ruby's ties to the mafia weren't just marginal, as the Warren Commission suggested. He was exactly the sort of person to be assigned an important and risky mission, and he was not the sort of person who would have suddenly shot Oswald in sorrow for the Kennedys. But one even more shocking fact was completely ignored by the Warren Commission. Lee Oswald, the one other person we know was plotting murder in Dallas that weekend, also was connected to the Carlos Marcello Mafia organization.
Oswald's uncle, Dutz Murrett, who brought Oswald up as a father, Oswald's own father having died in infancy, worked in the Marcello organization. He was a bookmaker and, according to reports, knew Marcello personally. Oswald was quite close to this Marcello-affiliated uncle during 1963, saw him many times.
Oswald was associated in various degrees with at least 6 members of the Marcello organization, with David Ferry, who worked for Marcello's lawyer, for Guy Bannister, a private investigator who did work for Marcello, who knew Oswald and knew Ferry.
And Ferry was working just about on a daily basis for Carlos Marcello in the fall of '63. He was working on a criminal case that Marcello was involved in.
Unquestionably, the Marcello criminal organization was well aware of the existence of Lee Harvey Oswald in New Orleans in the spring and summer of 1963.
Oswald operated a highly suspicious one-man pro-Castro organization in a small office building occupied by other men who were all outspokenly anti-Castro. 2 of those men, pilot David Ferry and former FBI agent Guy Bannister, worked for Carlos Marcello, who despised Castro. Oswald had previously known Ferry as leader of an air cadet group Oswald had joined in high school. Oswald, unlike Jack Ruby, was not a career mobster. He was a kid who had already compiled a record that could be viewed as kooky, having shot himself once to avoid an unwanted transfer in the Marine Corps and slashed his wrists to avoid deportation from the Soviet Union, where he had defected. Adding now to this kooky image by handing out pro-Castro leaflets, he was the perfect actor for the role of Patsy in an occasionally used mafia murder scenario. Ron Goldstock, one of America's most successful mob prosecutors, compares it to the way New York mafia boss Joe Colombo was shot at a televised public rally a few years after the Kennedy assassination.
The killing of Colombo was done in such a way that the killer himself was immediately assassinated, and the person who assassinated the killer then got away.
And the killer of Colombo was not a mafia guy. He was a criminal who...
That's right. He was a fringe person, somebody who they might be able to dupe into the actual killing, whether he knew what he was doing and why or not. The same thing may be true of Oswald.
Further diverting investigators from the Marcello connection were Oswald's brushes with U.S. intelligence. In the Marines, as a radar operator at a base for top-secret U-2 spy flights over the Soviet Union, he worked around CIA people, which made it even more suspicious that he learned Russian and defected to the USSR. His way in and out of Russia was surprisingly well greased, suggesting possible participation in one of many U.S. spy programs of the time, described by former CIA officer Victor Marchetti.
Everything suggests that he was involved in some sort of an intelligence program, probably sent over as bait in the hopes that he could either penetrate or be picked up by the KGB and doubled. Well, but of course not really being doubled.
Of different areas where action is needed. I think that in the field of organized crime, I think it's a very serious situation that's facing the country at the present time.
Bobby Kennedy, when he had joined the Justice Department, revitalized the organized crime and racketeering section. He had been counsel to the McClellan Committee on which Jack Kennedy had sat as a senator. He recognized the danger of organized crime in this country, and he was really the first Attorney General to do so in a vigorous way. He brought together some of the best and the brightest people to work in that Justice Department. He had the FBI working with lawyers, going out in different parts of the country, conducting investigations, prosecutions, and they were beginning to make a difference.
Bobby Kennedy, demonstrating his relentlessness, developed a source within the underworld, a person who later turned state's evidence. That was Joe Valachi. And Joe Valachi went public in, I think, the fall of 1963, testifying about who killed who did what to whom, and he was a soldier. He was an actual made member, a soldier within the Vito Genovese family, and was responsible for putting a lot of people in jail. Bobby Kennedy was probably the best crime fighter this country's ever had. He was the roughest on organized crime, and as Attorney General, he was eating mob guys for breakfast.
Under President Johnson and defense-oriented Attorney General Ramsey Clark, the war on the mafia predictably cooled off. Beyond the benefits reaped by the mafia in general on Kennedy's death, two men in particular had faced ruin if the Kennedys had stayed in office: Carlos Marcello and Jimmy Hoffa.
During the time of the Bay of Pigs invasion, Bobby Kennedy had authorized the literal kidnapping of Marcello off of New Orleans Street, put him on a private plane at the airport, and sent him to Guatemala.
Bobby Kennedy went on record as saying, "I want to be remembered as the guy who broke the mafia." In particular, he was incensed, he was enraged over Marcello's defiance of his deportation. Marcello had re-entered the country illegally, surreptitiously, about 2 months after Bobby Kennedy had deported him.
The Kennedys kept after Marcello, who was on trial the very day the shots were fired that removed Kennedy from office, saving Marcello's career. Hoffa faced the same problem. In his case, the charges ultimately cost him his career, but in 1963, ridding himself of his obsessed prosecutor may well have seemed his only way out, and he said as much to Grady Parton, a Louisiana Teamster leader who later turned government witness against Hoffa.
Parton told me that that Hoffa became outraged with Bobby Kennedy. He was going to firebomb his house. He was going to hit his house with plastic explosives at Hickory Hill, Virginia, burn the house down, kill Bob Kennedy, kill Ethel Kennedy, kill the entire family. And Ed Parton said, "Listen, Jim, if you're going to kill Bob Kennedy, go ahead, kill Bob Kennedy, but don't kill his family." And Hoffa replied, "No, to hell with them. They're Kennedys. I want them all dead."
Hoffa and Marcello were particularly close to each other.
The inter-involvement of Hoffa and Marcello was a very close one. For one thing, when Jimmy Hoffa was on trial in Tennessee, and during one of the recesses, Jimmy Hoffa came up to the assistant district attorney, asked about his friend Carlos Marcello, and then asked the assistant district attorney to be sure to remind Carlos Marcello that he had asked for him.
There are numerous actions of Ruby, Marcello, and Marcello's agents in the months before the assassination, even in the days before, that suggest their involvement in a criminal conspiracy.
The record shows that Ruby made a visit to New Orleans, saw Frank Caracci, who was lieutenant to Carlos Marcello. He made a phone call to Nafia Pecora, another Marcello lieutenant convicted of a drug offense. Pecora called Ruby back. His phone records show calls to people like Barney Baker, top Teamster thug.
During the weeks and months and days, and actually hours before the president's murder, Ruby received numerous telephone calls from some very interesting people. Some people who were very, very close to Jimmy Hoffa, including Murray W. Miller, the number 2 man in the Teamsters Union behind Hoffa. Barney Baker, Hoffa's number 1 leg breaker out of Chicago, 3 telephone calls to and from Baker.
These are only part of Ruby's calls and visits, as revealed by telephone company and hotel records. He met Pete Marcello, Carlos's brother and colleague, at the New Orleans bar that served as Pete Marcello's headquarters. And the weekend of the assassination, David Ferry, Marcello's personal aide and Oswald's friend, made a highly suspicious trip to Texas and driving through a storm-swept night to Houston on what he said was a hunting trip. Instead, witnesses say, he spent almost his entire time making and receiving calls from pay booths in Houston. He lied about it to the FBI, which learned, among other things, that he had neglected to take a gun on the hunting trip. Ferry was actually arrested in connection with the Kennedy assassination the following Monday, but the charges were dropped and he died suddenly and suspiciously just as another investigation was getting underway. Ruby also spent the weekend suspiciously, viewing the assassination from atop the plaza where it occurred, following the president to the hospital, and then stalking Oswald and talking with a stripper, Karen Carlin, whose sudden need for $25 Sunday morning was the cover story for Ruby's visit to the Western Union office across from the police station where he shot Oswald, supposedly on the spur of the moment.
Ruby supposedly received a telephone call from Karen Carlin at 10:19 Sunday morning.
An hour before he kills Oswald.
Right, in which she asked to borrow $25. And
she lives down the road in
right. It's not a big distance. And Ruby, the story is Ruby then left, drove down and sent the telegram, and 4 minutes later happened to saunter down to the police building and shoot Oswald. The fact is that Ruby was not in his apartment during the time of the call. 3 journalists and a policeman saw Ruby pacing and back and forth in front of that police building from 8 o'clock that morning. A cleaning woman who called Ruby that Sunday morning got a man. She didn't recognize his voice. He had no knowledge of her or their weekly cleaning arrangement. When Karen Carlin was first questioned by the Secret Service about the assassination, as the agent reported, she was terrified. She was so terrified she could barely speak. When she finally spoke, as we see in the Secret Service report, she said she believed there was a conspiracy by Oswald, Ruby, and others to kill President Kennedy, and that if she talked, that she would be killed.
A few months after the assassination, Karen Carlin was shot to death in a hotel room. There are other eyewitness accounts pointing to a conspiracy. Of course, unreliable witnesses often pop up in highly publicized cases, but these accounts all came at or before the assassination and concern Marcello. One is from Ed Becker, a Las Vegas promoter who had been seeking Marcello's help on a deal and visited the Godfather's vast Mississippi Delta hideaway.
Now, I have to be honest, I knew who I was talking to, and I think because I was from Las Vegas, he was probably more free with me than he would have been if I was from Washington, D.C. And so I started to needle him about being deported. Not in a way, but in a sort of a, gee, it was sure bad, what Bobby did to you, da-da-da-da. And he picked that up, and that's what happened. He started talking about there are ways in taking care of these things, you know. And now I'm interested, and I'm going to prompt him, you know. What do you mean you're going to kill him, you know, Bobby? And he says, no, you don't do that. And he says, you cut off the head, the tail dies. And that, you know, what does that mean to me, you know? And then a little later on, he's saying, you know, this guy's like a rock in your shoe, you know. You limp long enough, you're going to do something about it. Well, you know, as I say, we're drinking, listening to the music, and having a very good time. And then I realized he's very serious. I mean, he's not kidding with me. I really upset him by even asking these questions, and this is rattling around in his head, and this is the kind of stuff he's giving me.
Becker reported this incident to the FBI long before the assassination, and before the stone out of the shoe phrase became popularly known as mafia hit talk. A Cuban, Jose Alemán, has testified to a similar story about Marcelo's friend Traficante. And Marcelo biographer John Davis uncovered FBI files showing that a Georgia mayor and businessman, Eugene Sumner, actually reported seeing Oswald take a wad of bills from a Marcelo underboss at the restaurant Marcelo uses as a headquarters in New Orleans. The story is all the more believable because Sumner, in New Orleans for a business trip, apparently didn't know that the restaurant where he was having dinner and the manager he saw hand over the money were connected to the mafia.
Only 3 days after the assassination, he went straight to the FBI. Well, actually, he went to a police officer first, then the FBI, and told the whole story. They then sent him photographs of Lee Harvey Oswald, and he verified that that was the man he saw in Marcello's headquarters.
The FBI never followed up the Sumner report, and Sumner refuses to discuss it now. And there is still more evidence that requires us to think in terms of a conspiracy. Compelling evidence that a fake Oswald was busy creating a phony image for the real Oswald as a left-wing nut. The Warren Commission used the left-wing nut image in concluding Oswald was the lone assassin. It cited, among other things, a trip Oswald made to Mexico City 2 months before the assassination, in which he made himself highly visible at the Cuban and Soviet embassies. An investigator for the House Assassinations Committee, Edwin Lopez, pried loose the CIA's photographic records of everyone who entered or left the Cuban embassy in Mexico City, matching the strips of negatives against time logs on all 3 cameras at the embassy. He found no Oswald.
I'm a lawyer. I like to see evidence. And the evidence that we had was that there was no photograph. And if we had no photograph there and we had the negatives so that they had not been, it wasn't like someone had cut up and said between this time and this time we're going to reinsert them and retape them, etc. I mean, we had the photos there.
You have the strips of negatives.
The strips of negatives. We had
just
to,
one whole strip that was eliminated.
There could have been, but everyone that we spoke to in Mexico City and outside told us there were only 3 cameras. And we had the scripts for all cameras.
But the most persuasive evidence of a false Oswald comes from J. Edgar Hoover himself. Through the efforts of Marcelo biographer John Davis, we have obtained this astounding secret memo Hoover wrote to the head of the Secret Service, a memo never shown to the Warren Commission. The key paragraph says the FBI itself concluded that the visitor to the Soviet embassy, identifying himself as Lee Harvey Oswald, was not, in fact, Lee Harvey Oswald. 2 Oswalds mean one thing, a conspiracy. But Hoover never told the Warren Commission. It took until the late 1970s for the House Assassinations Committee to begin to discover the mafia links to the JFK assassination. The House Committee's last report suggested a mafia plot, but was carefully hedged and ultimately collapsed in a dispute over acoustical testing. But the committee pointed the way for new discoveries by Scheim, Davis, and others. Why didn't the Warren Commission report the relationships and activities that indicate a mafia conspiracy? Because the people the commission was counting on to give it the facts, FBI Chief J. Edgar Hoover and CIA Chief Allen Dulles, not to mention Attorney General Robert Kennedy himself, all had to cover up the facts. All 3 men knew that the Kennedys had approved Castro assassination plots and were determined to keep that secret. They also knew that the plots had involved mafia elements close to Marcello. A thorough investigation might turn this up. CIA chief and Warren Commission member Alan Dulles not only had the Castro secrets to protect, he may also have known that his agency used Oswald to spy on the USSR. It would have meant big trouble for either the spying itself or the link with Oswald to become known. Hoover, who controlled most of the Commission's information flow, had still other motives.
The FBI, which was more interested in the Red Scare and the witch hunts and the commie bashing, they were very much a part of the movement to move the attention away from the Kefauver Committee and organized crimes and syndicate crime, and to move it into the witch hunts of the House Un-American Activities Committee and the Joe McCarthy hearings of the early 1950s.
Robert Kennedy time and again chewed out J. Edgar Hoover for not getting the information on Carlos Marcello and his organization that he wanted. Okay, so if allegations come in linking Carlos Marcello to the assassination, that was the last thing J. Edgar Hoover ever wanted to hear. If it could have been shown that Carlos Marcello or members of his organization were involved in the assassination, it would have totally destroyed his reputation.
For everyone, including President Johnson, who wanted to get the country past the affair as soon as possible, the lone nut theory was convenient. Nicholas Katzenbach, running justice in Robert Kennedy's absence, signed off on that conclusion literally before the president had been buried. Alan Dulles promoted that idea at the Warren Commission's first meeting. Yet 25 years later, Aaron Cohn, one of the nation's most respected lawmen, says this regarding Carlos Marcello and the Kennedy assassination.
One of the toughest things to do in our society is to make people recognize that the old idea about anyone alleging guilt by association has to be waived when you start talking about the conspiracies of organized crime, because organized crime is crime by association. That I believe that there was an adequate basis in the official findings to justify an ultimate indictment by a grand jury, since I believe that there were the necessary ingredients of a conspiracy, two or more people involved, and at least one overt act.
The Warren Commission simply did not receive adequate information suggesting the possibility of a conspiracy involving organized crime, and I can give you some examples. We have already mentioned that David Ferry, an associate of Oswald and also of Carlos Marcello, was arrested 2 days after the assassination. The FBI conducted a very thorough investigation of David Ferry, and they found very, very many suspicious things about him. The information on Ferry and the reports, the FBI reports on Ferry, never even arrived at the Warren Commission. You didn't even see them. I also uncovered documents suggesting the possible involvement of the Marcello organization in the assassination, which never, these came into the FBI, these allegations came into the FBI about 3 or 4 days after the assassination. They never got to the Warren Commission. We could go on. There were, as we know, there were very, very unsavory plots on the part of the CIA in alliance with the Mafia to assassinate Fidel Castro, which Robert Kennedy, as Attorney General, knew about, which the Director of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, knew about, which Alan Dulles, who sat on the Warren Commission, knew about. These were never given to the Commission. The Commission knew nothing about them. They were never informed.
On the night of June 19th, 1975, a gunman entered the home of the former boss of the Chicago outfit, Sam Giancana, through the basement and shot him in the head and neck 7 times with a .22 caliber pistol.
Good evening. Sam Momo Giancana, the Chicago crime syndicate chieftain recently named in a reported CIA mafia plot to assassinate Fidel Castro, has been shot to death. Federal, state, and local law enforcement authorities say the killing late last night at the 65-year-old Giancana's suburban Oak Park home looks like an underworld execution. Sharon Lovejoy reports.
The killer was face-to-face with Sam Giancana when he fired the first bullet. It hit him in the mouth. 2 more slugs went in under the chin, 3 others in the back of the neck. Whoever hit Sam had to be a close companion, said one Chicago police commander today. He had to be very, very close to get in for the kill. This year, more trouble. Giancana was linked to an alleged CIA plot to assassinate Fidel Castro back in the early 60s. Once again, the government started pressing Giancana for information, and that may have been why he was killed.
Giancana's murder took place days before he was to testify before the church committee. The murder of his former boss prompted John Roselli to permanently leave Los Angeles and Las Vegas for Miami, Florida. Just days after the demise of Giancana, on June the 24th, Roselli testified for the first time before the 1975 U.S. Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, led by Idaho Senator Frank Church, about the CIA plan to kill Fidel Castro. He also made follow-up testimony on the 22nd of September that same year.
Today, the Senate CIA investigators heard testimony from underworld figure John Roselli about an alleged CIA mafia plot to assassinate Fidel Castro. Daniel Shore reports.
Camera shy and heavily guarded as might be expected after Sam Giancana's death, Roselli slipped up and down back stairs at the Capitol trying to avoid the press. But before the Senate committee waiving immunity, Roselli was fully cooperative. For 2.5 hours, he told of plotting with the CIA starting in 1960 to try to kill Castro, by poison, by rifle, trying to land hit teams by powerboat, one of the boats sunk by a Cuban patrol vessel. Chairman Frank Church found Roselli's first-hand account vivid but not complete.
He identified no one other than the government officials with which he dealt. That is to say, he identified no one else by name, but he did fill out the chronology and gave us a great deal of detail.
Was he in a position named government officials any higher than those in the CIA?
No, he was not.
What Roselli didn't know is who gave the CIA its orders, and it's because of this vagueness of command channels that the Senate committee is fighting with the White House over National Security Council and other documents. Daniel Shaw, CBS News.
Roselli testified last year to the Senate Intelligence Committee that he and longtime friend Sam Giancana were recruited by the CIA to assassinate Cuban Premier Fidel Castro. Before Giancana could testify, he was murdered.
In 1976, Roselli revealed that Sam Giancana told him that he had plotted the assassination of President Kennedy with Trafficante and Marcello. On April the 23rd, 1976, Roselli was called before the committee to testify about a conspiracy to kill President Kennedy. 3 months later, the committee wanted to recall Roselli for follow-up testimony. However, at this point, he had been missing since July the 28th.
Saturday, fishermen found a 55-gallon barrel wrapped in chains with a body inside. The victim was identified early Sunday as John Roselli, believed to be a key figure in underworld activities.
The FBI investigation into Roselli's death summarized that it was a result of a contract killing sanctioned by Chicago outfits consigliere Anthony Accardo. The 1992 published book Double Cross, which gets its name from the relationship between the Mafia and the Kennedys, describes Sam Giancana telling his son that Johnny Roselli shot JFK from the storm sewer.
For 9 years, Brazil has explored every fact and theory he could get his hands on. Now he hopes to explore the storm drains and sewers near Dealey Plaza in Dallas, where he thinks the other gunman escaped on that day, November 22nd, 1963.
Jack Brazil has a theory. He believes the gunman could have been hiding in the storm sewer along the motorcade route.
He could see the motorcade, he could see the lead car and the 4 motorcycles, he could see the president, and he had a perfect view of the president.
For 3 decades, he was house attorney to some of the most powerful mob bosses in America. Frank Regano not only defended criminals like Santo Trafficante and Jimmy Hoffa, he learned the inner workings of their operations. He's just completed a 1-year sentence in a medical provisional facility and has written his memoir, Mob Lawyer. Also here are his co-author, New York Times reporter Selwyn Rabb, and New York Post columnist Jack Newfield, who interviewed Frank Regano 2 years ago and was on this broadcast at that time. I'm pleased to have each of you here.
Frank is the first mob lawyer in our century to ever come forward and tell us what was really going on behind the scenes.
And you believe everything Frank tells you?
I wouldn't have written the book if I didn't.
Okay, I just want to have that on the record. Newfield, wait, get into you, Frank. Newfield, tell me, what do you think of this, and what do you think of Regano's story? And here is a man who steps forward, you know, who represented these guys, Trafficante, knew Carlos Marcello.
Counseled him also.
Counseled him as well. Knew Jimmy Hoffa, knew how the relationship, I mean, you buy all of this?
Well, the part of it that I did a
Frontline
documentary on that focused on the assassination of President Kennedy.
Right.
And I have, to this day, view the JFK assassination as this giant jigsaw puzzle that will always have 4 or 5 pieces missing. And when I met Frank, I felt he added 1 or 2 new pieces to the puzzle. What Frank added was, one, the deathbed confession by Trafficante to Frank, where he says to him 4 days before he dies, I think Carlos, meaning Marcello, screwed up. We should have killed Bobby and not Jack. I think that is an important piece in the puzzle. The other is that he was with Santo Trafficante the night President Kennedy was murdered.
And he was celebrating.
And he can describe the euphoria of Santo Trafficante. And I knew from writing a book about Robert Kennedy how much Bobby wanted to get rid of, prosecutorially, both Marcello and Trafficante, and already had Hoffa. And I think he provides reinforcement for the motive. Why kill President Kennedy? Get rid of Robert Kennedy as Attorney General.
First of all, I didn't retire from the practice of law until October of 1991. Until then, I was prohibited from disclosing client-attorney communications. I would have had a very difficult time with the Florida Bar Association.
Right. Tell me about the deathbed conversation, first of all, and what Trafficante said and why you believed him.
Well, first of all, the reason I believed him, I represented him for 27 years.
Never lied to you?
Never lied to me. Never lied to me. He would withhold information, but he would never lie. I never caught him in a lie. And we had a tacit understanding, he and I, that I would not ask him questions about his personal life, but only in matters regarding legal proceedings. But he never lied. Never lied at all. And when in 1986, when he was going to trial, he was a very, very sick man. And in fact, we had a common cardiologist who told me at the time that he only had a short period of time to live. He was on a dialysis machine 3 times a week and all. And when he came to see me a week before the trial, he was horrified at the thought of dying in prison. And he sought my assistance. And I can't tell you how horrified he was. And he's referred to me as Chia, always called me Chia, don't let me die in prison. Whatever you do, we've been friends all of these years, don't let me die in prison, that sort of thing. And I decided to represent him, much to my regrets now, but I decided to represent him. He was acquitted, and he did cause me to become, he could have prevented me from being indicted back in 1971. I think it was a combination of factors. I think that I was the only person that he could really talk to, and he wanted to get a number of things off of his chest.
All right, so you had this deathbed conversation. Yes. Tell me what they told you happened.
Insofar as...
Yeah, and what do you believe happened?
What he told me had happened was that Carlos blanked up. Anyhow, they made a mistake.
Yeah, right.
They should have killed Bobby instead. I don't pretend to know whether or not there was 1 gunman, 2 gunmen. I'm really not into that.
Yeah.
All I can tell you is that they had the motivation and they had the capability. These were 2 of the most devious and cunning minds I've ever run across in my life. And as evidence of the fact that they were capable of carrying something like that out, when the CIA decided that they wanted to eliminate Fidel Castro, they called on Santo Trafficante.
But they bungled that too.
No.
They did.
No, never.
Castro's alive. And all that stuff, the cigars and stuff, didn't work.
They took a dive.
No, well, Frank explains that, in effect, what Santo Trafficante did was con the CIA.
Oh,
he took their money.
Yeah, right.
Thinking he was going to do something, he just took their money and goodbye, fellas.
Yeah.
But what that tells me, though, is that they had more confidence in the mob eliminating Castro than they had their own agents,
Well, they didn't have a whole lot of confidence in the CIA at that point. I mean, it ought to be said after the Bay of Pigs.
What we're saying is the Southern mob wanted him killed
New Orleans and
variety of
Tampa,
reasons. Right.
specifically.
Both Santo Trafficante in Tampa in Florida and Carlos Marcello in Louisiana.
Right.
They needed Hoffa. Hoffa was their conduit to the pension fund for raping the Teamster pension fund.
Hoffa loaned him a lot of money out of the
and they needed him.
fund.
And if Bobby Kennedy was going to get Hoffa, a big source of their money was going to dry up.
And he quotes Jimmy Hoffa as saying, "You got to do something about this for me."
The other thing that people keep forgetting is that Carlos Marcello in Louisiana, one of his bookmaking rings was run by Dutz Millay. Dutz Millay was Lee Harvey Oswald's uncle. And Lee Harvey Oswald spent the summer of '63 in New Orleans, and he was close to Dutz Millay. So, I mean, what conclusion you can draw from that, we haven't got the smoking gun. All we're saying is here's some facts that haven't been known before.
And how did they get Oswald to do it then?
Well,
Jack,
remember one thing about the mob. Do you remember the Colombo assassination in Columbus
Joe
Circle?
Colombo.
Joe Colombo was
right.
assassinated.
The Colombo
Joey Gallo
family.
got a fall guy, a black person he met in prison to assassinate. And this has often been used by organized crime, by the mafia. You get somebody who's a straw man, a prop. Therefore, it will never come back to you. Charlie, one thing you're forgetting about Frank's credibility. Frank, before I met Frank, and before we wrote this book, Frank was interrogated by G. Robert Blakey.
Right.
Blakey is
Who was
probably
the general counsel to the House Committee.
the House Committee. He's also probably one of the most incomparable expert in organized crime in America.
And the point is?
He thinks Frank's story has the ring of truth.
Yeah.
But more than that, when we interviewed Blakey for our show,
Frontline.
I said, "Is Regano a revelation?" He says, "No, it's a confirmation of what I wrote 15 years ago in the House Assassination Committee report, where Blakey and the Congress wrote that Marcello, Trafficante, and Hoffa, quote, had means, motive, and opportunity to commit the assassination."
I'd like to make an observation along that line.
Okay.
Professor Blakey has certainly supported my theory. And let's keep in mind that he wrote the report for the House Select Committee on assassination for the assassination of the president, investigation. He wrote the report. In order to write that report, he had to read all of those documents, a lot of which have never been released to the public.
Right.
So if there's anything in those documents that contradict what I'm saying, he certainly wouldn't go public and support my position.
This information has been presented in the public interest to highlight the mob's role in the JFK assassination, murder of Lee Harvey Oswald, and others as part of a cover-up, as well as shining a light on the mob's relationship with the CIA. Thanks for watching.